Hi guys, BJ Miller here, palliative care doctor. We're here to finish the Q&A comment uh, portion of the caregiver webinar we just did this morning. With that, over to you, Sonia, for the other questions still
Thanks.
outstanding.
Thanks, VJ. So first question up that we got during this last caregiver session was, my best friend has Parkinson's. He has no savings and no family who are willing to help him. His long-term care plan is a mystery. I am trying to help him as best I can, but I am also working a full-time job. How do I work on my boundaries, knowing that there will likely be a point where I can't provide all his care and that part of this is his own life journey? In addition to that, she's also asking how to help elders who are declining, who have no resources or family, and who need long-term care. There seems to be help for wealthy people and programs for the very poor, but I am having a hard time trying to think of ways to help my friend who has never planned for long-term care and now has progressing Parkinson's.
Okay, so lots to say here, or a big, complex, and not uncommon situation. I mean, for starters, it points out how sort of unprepared we are in our systems, our healthcare system, our social systems, our social structures. We're all expected to be doing too many things, and there isn't built into any days or downtime to be with each other, to care for each other. It's a problem. So you're bumping up against a big structural problem, not just one coming from your friend. So that's just a comment. And I hope that through more conversation and honest sharing, that these issues come out of the closet into the fore, so policy changes can start to flow, et cetera. So anyway, thank you for speaking out. So, you know, the first point about your best friend with Parkinson's with no resources. Well, and as you said, you can't be you can't be bottomless, period. You have a job and the rest of your life, and even if you didn't, it still wouldn't be enough. So as you say, much of this is his own journey, his own path. There's no need to, to judge however he may have come to this point in his life without plans, without resources, etc. Here we are. So I would first try to exhaust what systems do exist for folks in these shoes. So if he really has no resources, then he would qualify for Medicaid, Medi-Cal if you're in California, but Medicaid. So the social safety net and the medical safety net for people who have no or few resources themselves. It's, filled with red tape. Sure, it's a bureaucratic big behemoth of a program. It's clunky, of course, and it's the best we got. I mean, it's something. And so through Medi-Cal or Medicaid, he would qualify for medical support, doctor's visits, et cetera, home care potentially, certainly hospice. And all of those services should be maximized because those are caregivers too, tending to him, not just left to you. But Meals on Wheels programs, ride share, social programs are also part of Medicaid. So first thing I would say is make sure he is maximizing what benefits are coming to him as a citizen through the Medicaid program. Within Medicaid or outside of it, if he already has a medical team, however he's gotten there, this is where a social worker can be so helpful, or a case manager can be so helpful, both of which you generally have access to through Medicaid. As people who can kind of keep a bird's eye view on things and link your friend to what services exist to decompress you, but also to get the care that he needs. And it can also be empowering. He needs to participate in all that. So that's one big answer. There used to be more things in most communities like adult daycare. For a number of reasons, that well has dried up largely. So maybe over time, or maybe in his community, there may still be an adult daycare center, which is a great place for him to spend time and socialize, but also sort of a hub of resources potentially, and just commiseration and social support. So that kind of thing can be very helpful, if rare. Also, sort of sticking with existing resources out there, hospice. I'm not sure where your friend is, of course, on his trajectory with Parkinson's, but at some point, Parkinson's is a non-curable terminal illness, and at some point he will be in the final throes, the final months of life. So keeping an eye out when he would qualify for hospice. Hospice is sort of bar none within our official healthcare system, the way to get the most services into the home. Period. End of story. So as soon as he qualifies for hospice, that would be the closest thing you're going to get to a surrogate family, and it will be paid for by Medicare and Medicaid. So maximizing all those services is very, very key. Obviously, keeping an eye out for other friends or people who might show up, strangers, neighbors who can be helpful. But at some point, no matter what other things can be cobbled together and what you might be able to do to cobble them together, again, it's still going to be a bottomless well. So you're going to be left to name your own boundaries with him. And that can be done super lovingly, like, you're my best friend. I love you so much. And gosh, I wish I could be here more often than I am, but I think you know this, but I've got work and other things that deserve or demand my attention or need my attention too. And I just need to name it because I don't want you to feel like I'm X, Y, or Z. Something like that. It can be just an honest conversation, but where you state what you can and can't do. That's not only reasonable, but it's essential. Otherwise, you'll just get soaked up. Again, the needs will be bottomless, so you can't pretend to tend to all of them. And in so many ways, a caregiver, especially with terminal illness, at some point you're left, again, as we commented earlier today, you're not gonna, there's only so much that can be done, and there's only so much that any one of us can do. And so you need to be able to look yourself in the mirror at the end of the day and feel good about what you're doing and not responsible for all the things that you can't do. And that's a little bit on you in terms of your own self-care and own sort of perspective making in this mix. So that's my answer. I think, Sonia, did we address the full question?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Okay, so next up is, what advice would you give someone about providing care to a care provider you see who's going through burnout?
Okay, so what advice would I give to a caregiver who's burning out, essentially, if I heard correctly?
Yeah, so maybe there's a friend who has another friend who's caring for, a family member, and you can see that they're having a hard time. How can that friend support the person acting as the caregiver?
Care for the caregiver, yes. Very important piece of this mix, sort of a broadening of the ecosystem. It's not just patient caregiver, it doesn't stop there. It's friends of the caregiver, friends of friends, the social structures. I mean, this is part of a larger ecosystem. So right on. So for wherever you are leaning into this question, sort of supporting someone who's actively caregiving. Well, one is you can just be sensitive to the things that he or she is going through by, joining conversations like this. Bearing witness, as we talked about earlier today, is a really key part of caregiving. Absolutely. So the caregiver witnessing the patient. But the same goes, that's a human thing. So the same goes for somebody witnessing the caregiver. So you can do that. You can see your friend. You can see the silent struggles that they have to deal with, the ways, the thanklessness of the job, all that stuff. You naming that, holding that space for your friend is invaluable. So in so many ways, the advice to you is caring for the caregiver is the same advice as to the caregiver caring for the patient. So that's really important. Reminding the caregiver that your friend that there's only so much that any one person can do, and reminding them of the essential nature of self-care, that it's not selfish or decadent for him or her to care for themselves. It's actually like the essential homework for them. So reminding them, helping them do that. Maybe it is, hey, I'm going for a bike ride, come join me. Just forcing them, no, you're coming with me, or hey, we're watching a movie now, I don't care, whatever it is. Just being a good friend in that way and not waiting for him or her to ask you. But if you know enough to know that that person's struggling, just show up for him, just as he or she is showing up for the patient. Now, beyond that, there are support groups for caregivers too. Those are hard to find. I mean, keeping an eye out for your community. Increasing, there are online support groups for caregivers as well. So just good old Googling your way to those. But those can be a way to, like what we're doing these webinars, is for folks to sort of share the subject together. So there's a suite of answers for you. Hopefully there's something helpful in there.
All right, next up, wondering if there are any type of support group organized offerings for the loved ones we as caregivers are caring for.
So wondering if there are support groups for the family, essentially, for.
I think what they're asking is support groups for the person who is receiving the care. So maybe they're receiving the care due to aging, maybe they're receiving the care due to illness, but some sort of support group for the other side, the other, side of the coin. So not the caregiver, but the receiver.
Yeah, right on. Okay, so yes, there are, and this is a great way. So back to the question ago, like if we're trying to help a friend, if you're trying to help care for the caregiver, well, looking for ways to decompress that caregiver, either sharing the load, encouraging them to let go of some pieces, or encouraging them to find their way to a support group is a wonderful way. But so back to this question. So there absolutely are specific specific support groups for patients out there. They're all over the place. They are, again, hard to find, but they're out there. So a lot of disease-specific support groups for patients. So, if that person's dealing with cancer in their cancer center, they may well host support groups for patients themselves. Or very often, the cancer center will have a resource center where you can go, and they tend to keep a list of active support groups going on in that community. So yeah, they exist. They can be hard to find, but they exist. So asking the medical team, asking the social work on the team, asking at the resource center if the hospital or health system or cancer center has one. Also, let's say ALS or Parkinson's, or pick an illness. Almost all the major illnesses that you come across have some sort of national or local advocacy organization. There is an ALS group, an ALS foundation, for example. Reaching out to those guys, they will often keep some sort of tally of disease-specific support groups for that particular illness. So there you go. And then there's also this poignancy of being in groups at all. It doesn't need to be specific to their illness. It doesn't even need to be specific to being a patient necessarily. It depends on what that person prefers. But just general support groups can be helpful. And it might be really nice when they're actually admixed caregivers and patients in the same group. Those exist too. Again, they're informal, hard to find, various degrees of meeting routinely, et cetera. It's kind of all over the map. So you kind of ask around, search the web, reach out to disease-specific foundations.
Okay, great. Next one. Could a caregiving crash course be an aspect of what a death doula does with a family taking care of someone at the end of their life?
Yeah. So short answer is yes. But just for the listeners out there, so doula work, beautiful, important, interesting work that's, most of us have been aware of midwives or doulas at the birthing moment of life. There's also very similar work at the end of life. So death doulas is the parlance. That is a sort of quasi-formal institution of its own now on the rise. There are training programs cropping up for death doulas, more and more of them. Certification training programs. Doula work is not nearly as standardized as, say, medical work. So it's the training and the competencies, et cetera, may be a little bit more sporadically felt in terms of when you hire a doula. It's not the same thing as relying on a medical degree per se. It's less routinized than that. It's also more free than that. So various doula programs, training programs have different flavors or different sort of approach, which is lovely. So it's sort of this somewhere between formal and informal caregiving is the work of doulas. But in general, it is a certification program. You want there to be some specific training. So it's not the same thing as a caregiver training course per se, but there certainly is a ton of overlap. A caregiver training program would have a lot to inform doula work and vice versa. So the short answer to the question would be yes. A longer answer to the question has something to do with what exactly a doula is. So yes, a lot of overlap there and mutual support across those two lines, caregiver and doula, but they're not superimposable, I would say, if that makes sense.
Okay, great. Next up, we had someone say, you spoke of the extra difficulties of caring for someone with dementia. How can we respond in a helpful way with family members who struggle and ask themselves why their loved one continues to live, often for years, when they have become shells of their former selves?
Right, dementia is so particularly tricky and difficult because, is what you're pointing to, the things that make a person, an individual, the characteristics, the personality traits, the persona, the idiosyncrasies, the mannerisms, all the things that make us unique individuals. A lot of that, a lot of those identifiers melt away over the course of dementia. And in the final advanced stages of dementia, the body is, as far as we can tell from the outside, is basically a bundle of reflexes at some point. And there may be little to no engagement or little to nothing recognizable about that person from their earlier life when they had their intellectual capacities, their cerebral capacities, their executive function, etc. So this is why dementia is so tricky. Is a person, the person, not just their body, but the person dissolves in a way. And it happens, generally speaking, most dementias play out over many years. So it's a long, agonizing, unceasing decline. And in some ways, it's sort of a dissolve that happens. So here I'm just naming the problems. And you can imagine caring for someone who's going through that is so difficult. The time frame issues, but also losing the person you love while their body is still there is just a real mind bender and has a lot to say with why it's so difficult caring for someone through dementia. So to the question, the details of the question, yeah, by some just why I guess I'd encourage you to be careful of projections here. So those of us who are walking around the planet, rolling around the planet, and have our personalities intact and are recognizable and have memory, etc., have a sort of a snowballing persona that moves through life and is recognizable and knowable. Well, it's one thing for us to sit here to say, gosh, when we see someone has advanced dementia and who's just a sack of reflexes, like we were saying, or just a sack of well, it certainly doesn't look like they're having a life that we would ever want or would even recognize as a life, maybe. But that may not be true from their point of view. It's very hard. Empathy can only get you so far. So I don't know that any of us can appreciate what it's like to be in the shoes of someone with full-blown dementia. We can guess, we can extrapolate, we can project, but that's about all we can do. So I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm just saying be careful of when you're projecting and assuming what it must like to be in those shoes. In either direction. Some people will project nothingness onto persons with dementia, and some people will project all sorts of meaning going on there, that the person somehow just not able to converse, but behind that mask, there's all these thoughts happening, all this stuff, experience happening. So people do this in both directions. I think your question applies. Families project these extremes, different family members project extremes, essentially kind of arguing over whether this person's existence has meaning or significance, or should continue on. Super hard. And there are advanced directives for people with dementia to sort of guide care. So for example, one thing that's really often very useful for folks who are living with dementia as a care plan is to get at some point when the person no longer can recognize us or is no longer showing interest in anything, no longer able to independently eat. These may be metrics that at some point make the family say, well, now's the time to get out of the way of death. Let's let nature take its course, whether that takes weeks or months or years. Let's say the next pneumonia that comes. Well, we're not going to treat it. We're going to make sure the person's comfortable, but we're going to get out of the way of death. That's often a really helpful care plan for folks who are in dementia. You can't really hasten death, not legally, and you can't really, and at some point, propping that body up to continue on just as a heartbeat at some point also smacks of sort of a cruelty of its own, depending on your belief system. So one way or another as a care plan, getting out of the way of death. But to the question here of conversing with family members who have different kinds of projections onto the scene, this is where patching together statements made by that person before they were demented can be very helpful of what they would consider a quality of life. Those can be very guiding. But there's really no hard and fast rule here. You're often left to sort of use your gut sense. But I would also just one more comment here is just because a lot of us feel we can't imagine a life without our intellects. I do think there's an aesthetic life, a life of the senses that can be of value. Even when someone can't string together thoughts anymore, I do think that people can still feel things. So sensory pleasures, music, maybe smells, that may be a way for that person to have some sort of an existence worth having. And the way it's worth having, you might guide by are they grimacing all the time? Are they crying out? Or do they seem contented? I think that's an important distinction. Folks with dementia are inherently in the moment. So you can really rely on, in so many ways, what you're reading from them in real time. So I would encourage you to do that as a family, to kind of parse through your projections versus what's probably happening for the person in the shoes. So sorry for a long-winded answer. It's a very complicated question and a common one too, and there's not an easy answer.
Thanks, BJ. Okay, final one is, at what age can parents or teachers, initiate a successful caregiving preparation course so we can begin to normalize the process as part of life's progression?
Right, normalizing the process of caregiving, care receiving as part of life's progression, beautiful sentiment. And so when you as a parent or teacher can begin to inculcate these lessons or that kind of point of view, I think the answer is all the time, anytime, because there's the mechanics of caregiving in this sort of frame of illness and aging, et cetera, like we've been talking about. But that is a sort of a specialized version of just human interaction in general. We are interdependent critters. That's just that's just an observation. I don't mean that as a religious statement. It's obvious enough. None of us needs no one. So how we interact, the barriers between self and other, that's a work in progress that we're continuously learning about. So grade school, preschool, infancy, you can begin to model that. And at some point in a young kid's age, maybe grade school, through stuffed animals or a goldfish, that may be a way to begin to learn loving something outside of yourself, caring, tending to something outside of yourself, empathizing with something outside of yourself. That's a beautiful way to start that happens naturally in childhood for many people. I do think schools can begin to use language around caregiving and interdependence right from the start. I've been lucky enough to speak in a few grade schools, ages 3rd grade through 6th grade. And that's been fascinating. And we talked about death and illness and stuff, and it was just fascinating to watch these young minds respond to it, because it was already sort of normalized for them if they were prompted to think about their own family structure or whether they'd had a pet that died, etc. So I would say we shouldn't underestimate what a kid's capable of comprehending. I think we need to find the right language for it. So what you teach a 2nd grader may be very different from what you teach an 8th grader versus a college student. But I do think this sort of spirit that undergirds caregiving, this sort of interdependence, this mutualism, this love, this idea that we all need support, it's normal, that it's part of an average, normal, healthy life. Those kinds of statements, that sort of vibe, I think we should be setting that vibe all the time. Hopefully that answers your question.
All right, we're at the end of our questions.
All right. Well, all right, guys. So happy Friday, happy Memorial Day weekend. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time.